So a bit about my background and sort of who I am, and I guess why you're talking to me today. I've been doing design and dev stuff for about, I don't know, 20 plus years. I'm actually a CS major and do a fair amount of programming myself. And just happen to also really enjoy doing a lot of design. In my career, I've typically managed UX teams or cross-functional teams that are researchers, designers, developers, and have worked in the digital space, mostly either building products, working for fintechs, or working as a consultant, building products for other people. So anywhere from mobile apps to tablet apps to web apps to intranets to portals to VR experiences. That's kind of what me and my team have been working on the last decade or so since I've been here in Charlotte. So with that said, let me share my screen a bit and get this going. Let's see, we want that one, and we flip that over. Okay, is that coming up okay?
Yep.
All right, let me pop up the chat just so I have it handy. Okay, good deal. So I'm going to talk a little bit about design thinking, and you're going to hear that a lot, especially as you transition into a career and as you work with more designers. It's really kind of a buzzword, but a few things to clarify before we really dig in is design is something that's been around for a really long time. And in any of the apps that you do, as you're moving around the city, wherever you live, we apply design principles anywhere from bridges to cars to homes to consumer products to digital interfaces to games. So I saw some Rocket League goodies going on there. And then user-centered design is really just a series of these design principles that we apply, whether it's a digital app or not, that we can follow. And this helps us understand the various problems that exist from the point of view of the people that actually are experiencing those challenges. So many UX or design practitioners refer to the end result of having applied these principles when building a product or service to what you've probably heard of as a user experience. So I like to define a good user experience through something that looks kind of like this. And it's based off the outcomes. So a good user experience is something that's accessible, it's credible, it's usable, it's findable, it's desirable, useful, and then at the very core of what we do, it's something that's valuable. You're either providing value to your users, your customers, to the business, the people that make money, and that's sort of how I like to think about it. It's a framing mechanism that I'll use very often when I'm trying to articulate what exactly is design and how do we know whether or not the design that we've created and built something around is actually going to be successful. So in a lot of companies, especially if they're lower on the maturity scale of their design practice, if you will, is that they sort of see design as only how it looks, making something look pretty. You may have asked a designer friend of yours, hey, just make it look nice. And that's kind of where we start. Nothing wrong with that, but it's a lot more nuanced than just something as simple as making it look pretty. There are a lot of really good looking applications, websites that are crap to use. It's just a pain. And then you have some other sites, and like Craigslist, I think is a great example, where it looks terrible, but it's super easy to use, and that they haven't changed their design in, geez, forever. They don't have to. It's working for them. So with that said, there's a quote, and I think we brought up Apple a little bit earlier. This is a quote from Steve Jobs that I always kind of appreciate. And the way that he thinks about design and sort of what he tried to incorporate there at Apple, whether you believe they're still on the same path or not, is it's not just what something looks like. It's what it feels like. It's how it works. And those three things together is really what creates a differentiated experience. Somebody have a question? Okay, we'll keep going. So design thinking, what exactly is this thing that you've probably heard tossed around? It's not new. It's been around since the 90s. It may be older than some of you, which is also totally fine. So it came about by Tim Brown, Dave Kelly from IDEO, which is a large user experience firm that still exists, that they coined this term. And essentially what they did is they took all of these design principles that have been floating around, and they sort of squished them all together into a consistent approach, and they called it design thinking. The intent behind the methodology. So as a consultant, I can definitely say this, is IDEO is a consultancy, that they encapsulated this thinking so they could sell a service. Most consultancies do that. If you look at a lot of the agile frameworks, Scrum, for example, that was developed by a consultancy to sell a service. Most of the most common things that you hear out there, agile, safe, design thinking, lean design, all of that stuff came about through consultancies, just trying to make things repeatable and consistent, and then ideally something they can sell. We do the same thing at EY, which is the company that I work for. One of the things that we kind of hook into, and why I think design thinking is important as you sort of grow in your career and expand your knowledge in the digital space, whether it's games or apps or whatever, is that there's a really low bar, and it doesn't take a lot to disrupt an industry or to be disrupted if you're not careful. So we use design thinking in a lot of cases to help us ultimately think of some innovative new solution that allows an organization to disrupt themselves, or to disrupt their competitors, or to avoid being disrupted. It takes a lot of work. It takes more than just designers. It takes folks that understand the business, folks that understand marketing, folks that understand operations, design, security, IT, development, to come together and really make those experiences unique. So keep that in mind. Now, if you were to Google design thinking, you're going to probably see something kind of like this. This is probably the most commonly referenced diagram that's floating out there. This is how IDEO initially defined design thinking. And it's basically broken up into 5 steps. Empathize, define, ideate, prototype, and test. I'll break those down in a little more detail and talk about where design and development and business sort of come into play as they're going through this process. It's also useful to know that this isn't the only way to think about design thinking. It wasn't ever intended to be this rigid step-by-step approach. It was intended to be really flexible. So we don't want to be dogmatic around this is the only way to think about design thinking, and we have to follow these steps exactly this way. You can jump around as your needs are. So the IDEO approach is probably the most common approach, but you have all these other variations. So it's nothing new. It's just how something matures. Agile today is different than Agile was when it came out, again, 20 years ago. And so they're all essentially trying to tell a story that resonates with different people based off of their needs. But in the end, they're all following user-centered design principles to try and solve real problems that human beings have and provide value. Now, I wouldn't be a good consultant if I didn't toss out my own version of this. This is how I like to visualize design thinking. And it's really just a series of iterative loops where you have a whole bunch of assumptions or guesses that you're making around what is the problem, how are we going to try and solve that. You're trying to make sense of that, so you're doing some research, you're talking to people, which is really important, and then you're bringing together your team. So on my teams, the best teams are the most diverse teams because they bring different backgrounds and diverse thinking, different ways of approaching and solving a problem. So with your diverse brain trust, you're able to come up with much better, more realistic solutions, and you miss less. So once you have a handful of ideas, you funnel those down into areas that you want to focus on. You begin to riff as a team to come up with something that's realistic. And then once you begin to get into this tangible realm, you build something, you measure the success, you learn from the good and the bad, and then you rotate through that cycle. So essentially you're trying to validate your ideas. Did you actually solve the right problems? And as you talk to more people and better understand how your solution applies to their day-to-day life, you can make informed decisions around how to improve that. And that's really, really important. So humans are at the center of the entire process here.
Bermon, let me ask
Yeah.
you a question because I think this is an important point. Everyone, for the most part, is either a junior or senior in high school right now. Maybe a couple anomalies to that. They spread from Charlotte to Wilmington to the Philadelphia area.
Nice.
They come from different backgrounds and upbringings. There are probably a wide variety of different economic backdrops to their stories. Certainly the diversity is something we're super proud of. It's almost 70% people of color, almost 20% female. I've tried to prioritize to them in some conversations in the past that diversity and that diversity of perspective, of background, everything is really important to the perspective they're going to bring. In your model, you've just laid out, number one is empathize, right? And the diversity is baked into the ability to build. Is there a more concrete example or just a color you could provide of why that's not just kind of like some kind of PC punchline that people say, but it's actually important in innovation in America's future and the world's future?
It is. So that's a really good point. A couple of examples, and definitely ping me with questions. We look at, let's actually use a Charlotte example, and I think Tarek, you're involved in some of this. If you look at the digital divide challenge that we have in the area, if you've ever seen Charlotte on a map, Charlotte has something that's pretty widely known as the crescent and the wedge. And if you looked at families that live in the crescent, that they are struggling, that they don't have access to fresh food, they don't have access to internet. Most of them are either have no internet connection at all, or they are using the internet through some type of a cell phone plan or mobile phone plan. And if you look at where the school systems have gone, even pre-pandemic, right before the pandemic happened, this was an issue. It's been exacerbated by it's been made more challenging, more visible, because we are in a pandemic. Is online learning and putting resources online has become more and more common as school systems have adapted a digital solution like Canvas or Blackboard or whatever else is out there. There's a few pretty common solutions out there. You all probably are using one of those now. Not every student has an environment in their home or a strong laptop or a strong internet connection, or one or two parents that are at home that can give them the structure that they need to be able to do at-home learning and access resources that they need to study their classes online. The majority of those families that are affected are people of color. If you look at the wedge in Charlotte, where it's predominantly Caucasian, affluent college graduate, they have the better infrastructure. They have better school systems, better internet, closer proximity to the things that they need to do their studies. Now, there are various reasons why Charlotte's in the scenario that it is right now. Some of that came about because we lacked diversity in thought as the city was being formed over the last 30, 40 years. People in power, even though they were well-intentioned with the busing system of like the late 70s and the other things that we tried to do to minimize some of these disparities, we kind of missed the mark. And as the city progressed and grew, there were large swaths of communities that aren't reaping the benefits of Charlotte growing, and Charlotte is still growing amazingly fast. So that's one example that I'm rambling around about now. But there's essentially a digital solution that people assumed wouldn't be an issue to access in a remote setting. And we've come to learn that that's really just not the case. And it's still a major issue for the city.
So basically, put another way, that's a wonderful example of a real challenge before us. And it connects back to your broader concept of the fundamentals of design thinking, which is if you can't empathize with the various flavors of the problem statement, whether that's the digital divide in different parts of town, or whether that's a mobile banking app that needs to serve people that are underbanked, then all you're trying to do is put your perspective and your background into the design of the innovation and the solution that's trying to solve a problem statement that maybe you don't comprehend. And I think that's probably the punchline for everyone as it relates to the importance, right, Bermon, of diverse teams, and why particularly those from different perspectives are so needed in these teams, in startup companies, in corporate tech companies, and all these things, because it gives a better cross-section of the ultimate problem statement that many of them are trying to solve.
Yeah, that is 100% right. And it's important to get out of our bubbles, irregardless of where we sit and sort of how big or small that bubble is. If you're building something just for yourself, then yeah, maybe not. But if somebody else is going to use it, odds are who you think might be your target demographic may be a little bit larger than what you initially thought. You're all in science class and you've learned the scientific method. We apply similar thinking in how we do design and how we come up with product ideas. In a lot of cases, we're creating a hypothesis. Now, our hypotheses are typically centered around human beings and how they use or don't use software or features. But it's our job in partnership with whomever is helping us on the business side and whoever is helping us on the technology side to then formulate how do we prove or disprove our hypothesis. And that's essentially what design thinking is trying to do, specifically with the validation cycle, is we need to make sure that we're testing a broad enough, diverse group of people to truly understand, are we solving the problem for the majority of folks? And then do we have any edge cases that we need to take into account? And it's really hard to do that if the entire team comes from the same socioeconomic background, live in the same part of the city, have had similar life experiences, because you're going to have blinders on, and there's going to be a whole bunch of important stuff going off in your peripheral vision that you just can't see because you don't have those life experiences. You don't think that way because you've never had to. So as and this is one thing that I appreciate about EY, is as an executive leader in the firm, it's my responsibility to make sure that any team that I put together is diverse in their background, in their age, in their gender, in their experience working. If I put together a team to build a product and everybody has 20 years of experience and they're all making six figures, then I get in trouble because I've done a terrible job putting together the appropriate team. And our leaders look at that really often to make sure that we're pulling in people with diverse perspectives, because it makes us better consultants and we can serve our clients better. And through that, we can serve our clients' customers better through that diverse thinking. Otherwise, we're just doing a bunch of really crappy work.
Can I ask you one follow-up question that I think will be highly relevant to these students? So very often folks like you and I end up doing elements of design thinking, clearly you much better than I, for solving problems today, right? Like a client or a need pops up and we need to solve a problem with technology. But the same applies to solving for opportunities, solving for fun things, not necessarily a problem, but how to, and I think that's where these YTAC students are right now. And what is relevant to them is they're trying to build a game to win money. They're trying to build, for the first time, many of them, their own esports game via the Unreal Engine. So it's less of a problem and more of a, how could I build a design from my head and something I think is cool to, like, you know, the same kind of empathize, define, ideate. We're giving them a whole lot of guidance on how to technically build it. And this is one of the very few moments they're going to be with someone who's going to be able to tell them maybe a framework or some ways to think about the other side of that, the creativity, the side that it doesn't matter how awesome you designed it up and how cool that website looks, like you said earlier, or that game looks in this case. If it sucks to play, well, you know, you probably aren't going to win the tournament.
Yeah. That's also right. The way that I think about it, especially when it comes to programming something, writing code becomes more and more expensive the more lines of code that you write. And it's easy to riff and sort of change your code if it's 1,000 lines or less. Once you add new features and new functionality, it becomes more and more complex over time, and it becomes harder to make those changes. So the way that I approach a lot of our projects, sort of the scaffolding that I'll use, is I'll break it down by the problems that I'm trying to solve, or the problems that I've run into as I've tried to pull this solution together. And then I'll essentially scaffold together sort of what I'm thinking. So you have a game. The game has various interfaces and actions that people can take. I'm not a very good illustrator, but what I'll do is I'll sort of storyboard sort of what I think is going to happen. So here's a scenario that there are 5 potential things that could happen in that scenario. So I'm going to kind of draw those out, just so I'm a visual person. It helps me think through things better. So I have the visual side there. And then when I'm trying to take what I think is my proposed solution and I start to convert that to code, I'm not writing my line of code and then going down and doing it line by line by line. I'm sort of scaffolding out pseudocode, if you will, typically in comments most of the time, where if there's a logic statement or a loop or some sort of declarative thing that my code needs to do, I'll write that out kind of long form, almost like I'm trying to tell a story. And then once it feels like my story is sort of written down in pseudocode, then I'll start to write the actual code. It helps me structure my thinking a little bit better as things start to translate into the actual programming language that you're using. And then it minimizes a lot of the rework because I've sort of thought through how I need to structure my code end to end. And then I start to fill in the gaps and iterate on how that functions. It also makes it easier when you're doing your testing and your debugging, especially. So you're beginning to create snippets of code that are more and more well-formed versus trying to write everything at once and then having to debug all over the place. I mean, you can definitely do it that way. It's a struggle sometimes.
I think that's really helpful. Does anyone want to jump in and just take a quick 30-second shot at telling Bermon what your game design kind of approach has been and let him critique it? I think that could be fun. Does anyone have the courage they'd like to jump up? Go ahead.
Okay, so I'm already using the design process that you're showing because that's the design process that we use within school. That exact image that you showed is posted up on the board with like brainstorm and and it's that exact same design process, right? So I already like understood what you were talking about, right? But for my game right now, I'm in the phase of like storyboarding, as you were saying, because usually I come up with a lot of game ideas and I have them in notes and they're just like all down here, like all on my desk right now. And like I'll just tell you what my game is. It's kind of silly, but it's like the best thing I could think of for like being like a beginner developer, because I'm not anywhere near intermediate yet. So but it's like like you're just a default cube, right? And that's it. You're just a cube, and you are basically just trying to get out the abyss of default cubes. That's literally it. Because I use Blender, and within Blender, usually when you start it up, you delete the default cube because it starts on the center of the screen, and no one really uses it. Because if you're trying to like import 3D models and stuff, you're not gonna want the default cube colliding with your 3D model that you're using. So
Right.
I saw this video that was like a joke, and it says like where the default cube goes once you delete it, and then I decided that I'll possibly make my game from there. And I don't know if it will turn out well, but hopefully like the processes go well with me brainstorming, because I'm still brainstorming the ideas right now and where it should go through storyboarding. And I have like I don't really have like the sketches are not that not that good, so I'm not gonna really show them. But
That's all right. The way that I think about sketching is it's throwaway. Like you're not trying to create a masterpiece in your sketches. So mine are scribbles, and that's totally fine. That's kind of what I would expect. I mean, the game sounds interesting. Like I like how you've taken something that folks are sort of poking at, and have turned that or trying to turn that into a game.
Yeah.
Sometimes silly games are the best games. I mean, you're not trying to create some super duper complex like RPG type game. So yeah, no, I dig it. I dig the concept.
Dang, thank you. It's nice to hear. Yeah,
Well,
exactly. You're right. Whoever's saying that engineering design class, PLDW, you're right. In our AP course. Dang, you might as well
thanks,
listen to my
Giovanni.
score, dude.
Anyone
Sorry.
else want to take one more shot before we let Berman finish up, telling him and letting him critique your approach to design thinking? Any other courageous soul out there other than Giovanni? You all are trying to hide your secrets so no one steals them, I bet. All right, well, good. Giovanni, thanks for volunteering for that. So Berman, I'll let you finish up there.
Okay, I'm gonna sort of zip through a couple of these pieces that I think you might find useful. Let's see. Let's do this. So let me quickly break these down, and then I'll touch on a couple of things. So empathize. In most modern design thinking approaches, that they have empathize or empathy as the distinct phase. One of the things that I want to point out is that it's not you empathize once and you move on to the next step and you never think about your users ever again. That would be silly. So we don't do it that way. The empathy phase, their intent is it's essentially a research phase. You're trying to uncover who are your users, what are they trying to accomplish, how does your solution, your proposed solution support or impede their goals of being successful. So those are three questions that I ask myself all the time when I'm coming up with an idea or trying to add a new feature into an application or a game or something that I'm trying to do. Is like, all right, really, who are my users? What are they trying to accomplish? And then if I do something this way or that way, does it make it harder or easier for them to accomplish what they think they need to accomplish? There are a handful of methods that we use. I like using interviews just to talk to people, get an idea what they're doing. And then contextual inquiries, I think, are particularly interesting on games specifically. It's one thing to bring somebody into a lab, and some game studios have these full usability labs where they'll bring people in, they'll bring gamers in and have them play these games in the lab. They have eye tracking equipment so they can see where people's eyes are moving on the screen. And sort of seeing does the interface and the menu and whatever else is there in their HUD draw gaze appropriately. Contextual inquiries are essentially observing a user's behavior in the context where they would typically use a game, so in their home or maybe a coffee shop or somewhere. So those I love doing, and we do this quite often where let's say I'm working on a mobile app, or in your case, you're working on a game. we would go to an e-commerce store. So like we did something for Rack Room Shoes and built them a mobile application. We would actually go into a series of rack rooms and put this really clunky prototype in people's hands and have them use them in the context of their shopping. So you have folks that are shopping for themselves or shopping for a spouse or trying to like hold a kid in one hand and use the phone with one hand in the other. And you get a lot of really interesting data as you do that. So depending on if your game is web-based or you're going to put it on a touch device, context is important because it dictates how people use something. And then it gives you a chance to understand what are the distractions or that may impact your approach. The define phase is, you've done some research, you framed your thinking a little bit more, and now it's time to synthesize that and really focusing on the most important parts that you want to try and solution around. Personas and journey maps are really, really common. Journey maps are also helpful in gaming specifically because you're essentially, if you're doing like a turn-based role-playing game or anything like that, or if you're trying to tell, you're using storytelling as an approach. So you think of things like Grand Theft Auto or Cyberpunk 2077 that just came out. That they likely sat down and mapped out this fairly complex story with different arcs and branches where people could go. That's essentially a journey map. And we use it all the time because you're trying to understand the journey that a user or a gamer could follow and what needs to happen. So it helps you visualize the story, make it cohesive so it doesn't feel disjointed as people are moving from scenario to scenario or one section of the story to another. And then, we do the ideation where we've identified the problem or the feature that we're going to try and create. We've done the research. We have a really good idea around our hypothesis and how we're going to try and validate or invalidate that. We're listing out the assumptions that we've made as we thought through all this stuff. And then we're going to try and do a whole bunch of ideation. So this is where brainstorming comes in. We actually use something called Crazy Eights, especially for working with a team. And it's basically a 4-minute ideation session where you give people either 8 sticky notes or 8 Post-it notes, and you have them jot down an idea or illustrate an idea every 30 seconds for 4 minutes. So if you're doing this with a fairly large crowd, you can get a whole bunch of ideas out there really quickly. And then we use a couple different methods to try and prioritize those. I use something called mealtime. So let's say that I have 50 different ideas. Mealtime is essentially you're categorizing those into, let's say you're working on features, you have a bunch of ideas for features. You categorize those in veggies, meats, and desserts. So veggies are your must-haves. You could flip veggies and meats depending on sort of how you manage your diet. Maybe it's, I don't know, Cheez-Its and cupcakes. I don't know. But it's veggies for the must-haves, meats for the should-haves, and then desserts are sort of the nice-to-have. If I have time and it's a rainy day, maybe I jump in and drop in some new features there. And then when we prototype. Prototyping is an interesting thing, especially for gaming. We do prototyping a handful of different ways. That there's low fidelity where we're sketching. We do sketching a lot because it's cheap and fast. Sometimes we'll do paper prototyping for something that has like a physical build to it. We'll use construction. It's almost like kindergarten again. We'll use construction paper and Sharpies and scissors and tape to build some of these physical structures. Now we use storyboarding a lot as well, especially for anything that's story-based. 3D printing is a thing as well. So it's like the high fidelity version of a paper prototype. And then we'll do like interactive mock-ups and simulations. So that there are some really cool tools like Mural or Envision that would allow you to take sketches or sort of static 3D renderings of what you think your interface or your game might look like. And you can sort of move people through different objects, different scenarios, And again, it's sort of cheap and inexpensive, especially if you already have your 3D objects sort of sitting on a screen somewhere, and you can walk people through what you're thinking and tell a story. So that's really helpful. Let's see. And then the last one is we're testing. So for something like a game, something like usability testing is still sort of important. You want to make sure that people understand how to navigate as your games become more and more complex. You have to onboard them in a realistic way. Personal opinion, game tutorials are the worst things in the world. They're terrible. But if you can simplify how you get people comfortable in using your game, that is super important. So usability testing is a way or method that we use to get our game in people's hands, have them run through specific scenarios, and then measure whether or not they could complete those scenarios in a realistic amount of time. And if they couldn't complete the scenarios at all, it gives us a lot of really good data to understand, well, is it because this was labeled wrong, or it's really hard to see this item or this navigation section or this waypoint or whatever that prevents them from successfully moving from scenario to scenario as they go through the game. So I'm going to leave you with a quote, and then we can do a little bit of Q&A. There's, I don't know if you've ever heard of the Shakers before, but the Shakers have a philosophy, a design philosophy that really resonates with me. And essentially what they're saying is, don't make something just to make something. When we make things, they need to be useful and they need to be necessary. And if they can be both useful and necessary, then we should make them look beautiful. That there's nothing wrong with that. So anything that you put out in the world, make it necessary, make it useful. And if you can do both of those things, take the time and make it beautiful. And that will really help whatever you create stand out and differentiate yourself. So if you want to chat, I do office hours every Friday morning from 7 to 9 a.m. I'm kind of an early bird. So glad to chat if you want to get some feedback on your game. I'll keep it super secret. And that there are 15-minute blocks of time. And yeah, so what questions do you have?
Yeah, Alicia.
How do you apply this to your work? Like, you do consulting?
Yeah.
So do you run through this whole process for like one project in a year, or is this like a month? How do you work on this?
That's a really good question. It is super duper flexible. That there's a sprint version of this where you run through things in a few days or a week. And then let's say the Rack Room Shoes mobile app, that was a 6-month project. And we spent what we call the discovery phase, where we were just like, I'm not in retail. I've never sold shoes before. I don't even buy shoes very often. I just walk around barefoot now. I haven't bought shoes in a long time. But essentially, we essentially took this process and you iterate through, you loop through it continually as you go through things. And so the way that we took this, almost like taking a game, like we had this complex series of interactions that we needed to create to accomplish the criteria that the business folks told us we needed to do. So we broke those down into little chunks or smaller chunks. And then each chunk essentially went through that design thinking approach. And the way that we incorporated our developers is they were included in the research, they were included in the design conversations. And then when it came time to actually prototype something, we worked pretty closely with them to take our design ideas, have them turn that into something that was functional. And then we would jointly go in and do those usability studies in one of the Rack Room stores. And then that would give us enough data to go, you know what, this feature makes sense, it works. We're going to get that ready to push that into a production environment so that like the actual customers can start to use that feature. If things didn't work well, because we had the developers and because we had the designers in the same spot, we could actually do some iterations there in the store itself and take maybe 30 minutes, couple hours to sort of revamp how that feature was working. They could make some adjustments in code and then give us a new prototype that we could then retest. So things can go really quickly or a little more slowly depending on how complex something is. So it's flexible. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, yeah, it does. And what is the title? What is your official title?
Oh, geez. What am I calling myself today? Innovation and strategy leader. I think that's the title. Most folks in my role are typically you're a product, unless you're managing people. You're typically a UX designer, a UI designer, a product designer, maybe a product manager if you're on the design side.
Great. So, quick, one more question, Ethan. Why don't you go? I saw your hand up, and then we'll. This is a beautiful transition for the last 8 minutes of our program today. Go ahead,
Okay,
Ethan.
so my question is, what is your favorite thing that either you personally or your team as a whole has designed?
Ooh, the funnest thing that I've ever worked on, and it's actually what brought me to Charlotte, is I used to work for a NASCAR publishing company. Not a NASCAR fan, really, but worked for the Biz Journals here in Charlotte. They had just started a new division, and it was literally myself, a developer, and a business guy. So a team of three, and they just wanted to see how fast we could move. So we built a custom social media network on top of NASCAR for the NASCAR community. We built a classifieds product, sort of like Craigslist, but better. We built a new content management system. We built some e-commerce solutions. And again, it's just three of us. We only worked there for 2.5, 3 years. But it was a super small team. We got to do whatever the heck we wanted to. They would buy us whatever we needed to build this stuff. Before like AWS and the cloud stuff was really a thing that made it really easy to deploy stuff. We got to play with sort of the precursor to all that. There was a sort of a cloud provider called SliceHost that would allow you to provision a server and then sort of on the fly increase or decrease the resources that server would use. It's super simple to do now, but 12, 15 years ago, it was super complicated. So SliceHost and some other similar services were some of the first sort of innovative hosting platforms that were really geared towards more complex applications. We built everything in Ruby on Rails, which was also a blast. So yeah, it was just a lot of fun. I was like early 20s, just working and building stuff with a bunch of other, early to mid 20s folks, and didn't have a lot of folks standing over our shoulder, breathing down our neck, telling us that we could or couldn't do something. So that it was a lot of fun.
That's great. Bermon, we can't thank you enough for joining us, spending time with this cohort. Folks, let's give him a big round of applause. And I'll tell you, it couldn't be more timely. Like, people pay a lot of money to hear Bermon talk about stuff, and you guys just got to experience that. And now it's the perfect transition, because Ponce is going to spend the next 6 or 7 minutes exactly tailored to the inspiration you just heard from Bermon in picking up inside the Unreal Engine with his regular tutorial. I think today, Ponce, you're talking about particles and light, and it's not just about him showing you how to access and configure them, but also how does it fit into the design thinking, right? So Ponce, why don't you take it from there and finish this out?